Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Bridging the Gap Between Theory and Practice webinar series, proudly presented by World Heritage USA with the support of the Historic Preservation Education Foundation. My name is Janice Harrington, and I am Programs Coordinator for World Heritage USA. Thank you for joining us here today. This series is designed to support emerging professionals in the field of heritage preservation by providing specialized training that helps bridge the disconnect between academic study and real-world application. Whether you're just beginning your career or are an established professional looking to revisit foundational concepts in a new way, this series offers insights and resources to deepen your knowledge and practice. In this episode, we'll explore a cornerstone of preservation practice, project planning and management. From working with state historic preservation offices to knowing when to bring in many other experts, we'll provide an overview of the keys to successful planning and project management. We will take a look at the differences between public and private bidding, what's necessary to create tight design documents, and address who takes on the risk in historic preservation projects. To guide us through this topic, we're joined by two experts working in the field. Whether you're new to this type of work or looking to expand your knowledge, this conversation will offer insights and resources you can apply to your own work. Our speakers will provide an overview of project planning and management, discuss the various stakeholders who may be involved, and see examples of types of projects that emerging professionals working in historic preservation may encounter. The speakers will draw from their vast experience to share tips, examples, and best practices. We encourage you to engage with today's discussion by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please be sure to post your questions in the Q&A section rather than the live chat. Be sure to visit the Bridging the Gap webpage after the webinar for additional resources suggested by today's speakers to support your further learning. Let's get started with our first speaker, Miranda Grieder. Miranda serves as the Federal and State Historic Preservation Project Reviewer for East Texas in the Division of Architecture at the Texas State Historic Preservation Office, Texas Historical Commission. In this role, she evaluates a wide range of preservation projects, applying her expertise to ensure that work on historic resources meets state and federal standards. Before joining the Texas State Historic Preservation Office, Miranda built a diverse career in architectural practice, working with multiple design firms on residential, small commercial, institutional, historic downtown revitalization, and landscape projects. Her professional experience includes both the rehabilitation of historic structures and new construction. She also owned and operated her own architecture and design practice for 5 years, broadening her experience in project management and client engagement. From 2008 to 2013, Miranda was a visiting assistant professor at the University of Southern Mississippi, where she taught architecture and interior design while conducting research focused on sustainability and environmental psychology. She is a licensed interior designer in Texas and a LEED accredited professional in building design and construction. She holds a BA in archaeology and anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin and a Master of Architecture degree from the University of Kansas. I am very pleased to now hand the floor over to Miranda.
Thank you so much, Janice. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Thank you, Janice. Today, I'll be giving a brief overview of project planning and management in the context of historic preservation. Before I start, however, I thought I would give a quick word a little bit more about my background. I came to the Texas Historical Commission through a non-linear path, starting with archaeology, then architecture, private practice, teaching at a public university, and then owning my own design business, which ultimately led me here. I share that because much like preservation projects, there's no single path in this field. Historic preservation benefits from diverse skills and experiences, so don't be afraid of a career path that might not make sense to anyone but you. Also, one quick note, due to time constraints, I'll move through the slides, some of the slides quickly, but they'll be available, as Janice said, after the webinar is posted on the Bridging the Gap website. Because of the shortness of this presentation, I'm going to try to focus on what seems to me to be consistent across all historic preservation projects, regardless of size or budget. The first principle or goal of historic preservation is do no harm. If some harm is inevitable, attempt to minimize or mitigate it. Recognize that in the context of historic preservation, achieving the best outcome is a balancing act. Also consistent for all projects is this basic structure of what must be accounted for. Every project should account for who needs to be at the table and why. Every project will have resources that will aid the success of the project and will have restraints in the form of requirements and restrictions that will impact possible project outcomes. Finally, the goal for all projects before any physical action takes place should be a preservation master plan. It's critical to identify stakeholders and consultants who need to be at the table at the beginning. For example, the property owner, which may be public, private, or nonprofit, people with information that could be former owners and occupants, community members, previously hired professionals, anyone with knowledge of the site, prior work that's been performed, and the site's significance or important events or associations that may have happened there. Also at the table needs to be review authorities, so you can make sure that you can anticipate timelines and requirements. And that will depend on funding sources and legal protections, et cetera, of your property. Also, people who care about the property for whatever reason. It's important to lay the foundation of support by giving a voice to those invested emotionally in the outcome of the project, to reduce the potential for future conflicts and to ultimately create a more meaningful project outcome. Getting back to what is consistent for all projects, projects will have restraints in the form of requirements and restrictions that will impact possible project outcomes. For those with little historic preservation experience, the challenge can feel daunting. Every project is unique. In every project, there is the tension between budget constraints and emotions, the hopes and dreams of the stakeholders. Also lack of control over the timeline. With historic preservation, lots of surprises can occur. Questions of whether it's possible can it be saved? In my experience, almost everything can be saved given enough money and expertise. How to prioritize? Everything has a story. How do you define that period of significance? Also, the question of purity versus flexibility, finding a right balance when it comes to historic preservation decision-making. Matchmaking, historic preservation is a dating game. How to find the right professionals and the right team. And when the budget or support may run out with an endangered property, how do you buy time? So for project success, it's critical as soon as possible to identify those restrictions that are going to affect the project. And I know this is a long list, but some of the major ones typically are review authority, review timelines, regulation codes, ADA, those timelines and requirements, budget restraints. Insurance can be a big one on historic preservation projects. Sometimes we will require certain materials. So getting, the lay of the land as soon as possible on that. Conditions and endangerments, encroachments, etc. And then just to give an example of this Texas Historical Commission's review authority, as a federal and state project reviewer, I review Section 106 projects, which I know are discussed in episode 2 of this Bridging the Gap series. So Section 106 review is required when a project involves federal funding or federal permits. State reviews apply when a property has a designation, a state easement or covenant, or a state-owned or the property is state-owned and over 50 years old. Excuse me. All projects are evaluated for compliance with the National Park Service's Secretary of the Interior standards, which I will discuss in more detail in a later slide. Identifying what resources are available to you. Every state has a state historic preservation office, or a SHPO, and SHPOs are an excellent free resource for guidance, connecting you to additional resources and helping facilitate potential partnerships. They can also assist with understanding eligibility for historic tax credits, grants, and educational opportunities. The National Park Service website is another essential resource. In addition to the Secretary of Interior standards, it provides guidelines, preservation briefs, technical notes that offer critical guidance for virtually any historic preservation project. Then there's also the Library of Congress, historical archives, local libraries, or historical research resources through preservation professionals, architects, engineers, just reaching out to professionals for consultation, county historical commissions and local historic commissions, preservation organizations, et cetera, et cetera. So for a SHPO example, the THC consists of 5 divisions consisting of reviewers and programs for the public, offering all kinds of educational resources and project support. So just to say that a lot of free resources, guidance, and support can be found just by reaching out to your state's SHPO. Another critical resource, or critical project planning resource, is the National Park Service's Secretary of Interior standards, which I mentioned before, which guides the selection of appropriate treatments for historic buildings, structures, and landscapes. These were actually covered in episode 1, so I won't go into each one of them here, but just to say that there are 4 treatment standards: the preservation standard, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. I strongly recommend revisiting their definitions until they become second nature in the design and planning process. What's critical, though, to understand about the standards is that the appropriate treatment or treatments, sometimes you will use more than one in a project, will depend on the project's historical significance, physical condition, and proposed new use. So questions like, is the site a rare surviving work or associated with an important event? Has its original form survived intact, or have later alterations also gained significance? Will the new use differ, and how easily can the property be adapted to that new use? In general, highly significant or character-defining features should be preserved. Features that are not significant may allow for some alterations. Significant features no longer exist, may be reconstructed, but only when sufficient documentation exists to do so with integrity. Ultimately, the key question is whether the proposed scope of work complies with the Secretary of the Interior standards. In the interest of time, I won't go into extensive detail, but I do want to emphasize the critical importance of the National Park Service's Preservation Brief number 43, the preparation and use of historic structure reports. An HSR is similar to, or can be the same as, what is often referred to as a preservation master plan. It compiles the full body of project information into a single cohesive document, including historical research, existing conditions, budget planning, treatment recommendations, documentation of completed work, guidance for future maintenance, and additional recommended research. Most larger historic preservation construction projects follow a generally recommended sequence of work. This often begins with non-damaging reconnaissance, such as infrared imaging and other non-invasive tools to identify conditions and hazards while minimizing impacts. Hazard remediation and selective demolition typically follow, then major structural repairs, building envelope and roof work and building systems. Projects usually conclude with interior finish work. Throughout the process, unexpected conditions are common, making flexibility essential. Recordation should occur before, during, and after, with full documentation completed prior to any demolition to ensure significant features and conditions are preserved in the permanent record. Professionals. So when do you need them? You typically need professional expertise when a project requires specialized skills, proper equipment, or adequate manpower, beyond what an owner or volunteer team can reasonably provide. How to find the right people. So look for professionals with experience on similar successful projects. Ask for detailed questions and look for relevant preservation experience. Seek professional recommendations from trusted sources, and attend conferences and participate in preservation organizations and networks. In terms of leveraging resources, historic districts, designations, subject markers, local landmark status, all of that can be powerful tools to strengthening funding applications, attracting key partnerships, increasing project visibility and credibility. Preservation grants typically look for three core elements. Endangerment, why action is urgently needed. Significance, why the resource matters. Project viability, why this project is achievable and sustainable. Maintenance is preferred over repair, of course. Future planning and historic preservation generally falls into three different categories. Cyclical maintenance, which is planned and preventative. Corrective work, which addresses deterioration after it occurs, which is less ideal. And disaster response, which involves urgent repairs following system failures that threaten health and safety, such as storms and natural disasters. And here's a list of my recommended resources. As I mentioned, the National Park Service's preservation brief number 43. And I also have listed the Texas Historical Commission's Historic Courthouse Maintenance Handbook, which a link will be provided for that. It doesn't just have resources for or guidance for courthouses. It actually has guidance for all different types of projects, so it's relevant, for any project type, in my opinion. Also, a book entitled "Buying Time for Heritage." That's How to Save an Endangered Historic Property by Howard J. Myrick. And I just found that to be an excellent source for, and guidance with case studies, giving all types of resources and guidance. And so I think that would be a great resource. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Miranda. I'm really looking forward to revisiting some of your points during the Q&A session. Right now, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Olga Hathaway. Olga is a senior level consultant and project manager with BES, a building enclosure firm based in Boston, Massachusetts, and Providence, Rhode Island. With nearly 20 years of professional experience, Olga specializes in the preservation and rehabilitation of historic structures, a focus that is her expertise and passion. Throughout her career, Olga has contributed to a wide range of projects ranging from stabilization repairs to comprehensive envelope restorations, guiding them from initial research and assessment through construction administration. Her experience spans both the consultant and contractor sides of the industry, providing her with valuable insight and appreciation for the challenges and perspectives of each role. Olga is an active advocate for preservation and professional development within the building enclosure community. She is especially involved with the Association for Preservation Technology Northeast chapter, where she has been an active board member. She also regularly participates in industry events and is dedicated to mentorship and training of junior staff, helping to cultivate the next generation of professionals in the field. Olga holds a Master of Science in Building Conservation from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Northeastern University. I'm very pleased to now hand it over to Olga.
Thank you, Janice, for that nice introduction. Thank you, Miranda. That was a wonderful overview, and it makes my presentation much easier after your comprehensive overview of the process and a lot of insight into working with SHPO and historic agencies on these types of projects. So I'm going to try to complement what Miranda has gone through and basically give everyone a consultant perspective on working on all types of restoration, renovation, rehabilitation type projects. So in my presentation, I'm kind of going to go through this agenda, just a brief overview of my background, and then getting into the project steps, how we see it, the role of a consultant in a project, considerations for historic projects, and just the steps of going through each project, as well as some takeaways and resources. So Janice already gave a great overview of my background. Basically, I come from an engineering background with a little bit of architectural insight. And then I went back after a couple of years of working, I went back and got my master's in preservation because in my first couple of years of working with buildings, I realized that historic buildings were really what I was passionate about. I've had the opportunity to work at both building envelope firms as well as for a very small boutique historic structural preservation firm, which was a great opportunity to kind of see different realm of projects, doing a lot of SHPO projects, grant funded projects, really projects that struggle to get funding versus working for a bigger firm that did a lot of commercial buildings and a lot of bigger projects from education and university campuses, hospitals, things like that. Things that are also wonderful projects, but have a lot more funding usually to work with. And then I had the opportunity at one point in my career to work for a historic masonry preservation contractor for a huge restoration project for a very historic town hall. And, you know, from the consultant's perspective, working with a contractor, you have one opinion, but being on the contractor side and getting to experience how they see the whole process of the project and the challenges they're faced with when consultants are asking for certain things, that definitely gave me a much better perspective on being on the contractor side. So it was a really wonderful experience to be able to do that as part of my career. So I'm going to start with just talking about steps of a project. So Miranda touched on this already, but basically on our side, project need is identified. The owner, client of a building realizes sometimes that they need something done. Sometimes it could be something very small, like the building is experiencing a persistent leak. And sometimes they notice, you know, the roof or the exterior wall components appear to be failing. Worst case scenario, there is some sort of failure, like a section of plaster collapses inside a building or exterior masonry components fall. But in many cases, it can be combinations of the above, or in other instances, an owner might just be in general thinking about general building maintenance or wanting to have a building evaluated because they're interested in changing the use, or the building is getting interior renovations, something like that. So there are all sorts of reasons why a project might become a project. Then once that project is identified, it gets released depending on who has identified the project, if it's a public or private sector client. If it's a private sector, they might already have consultants or people they work with, and they go right to them. So they will just ask, for us to help provide them with a scope and provide them with budgets, and a project kind of organically involves that way. But a lot of times, people are looking to get some competitive pricing for the cost of what it would take to do their project. So in a private sector, they could reach out to multiple consultants and get them all to submit proposals. In the public sector, that would usually be a more stringent RFP or an RFQ process, a request for proposals or request for qualifications. The main difference being a request for qualifications would go out to, both of these cases, they would get posted on a public bidding platform, and anyone who has access can download and obtain the documents, review them. With an RFP, you're going to be providing qualifications package as well as a fee proposal. With an RFQ package, it will just be a qualifications package that you're providing. The client then goes through that. Sometimes they have a board that's involved in the selection process. They might shortlist a few companies, ask them to come back for interviews, then make decisions that way as to who they're going to be proceeding with. So on the consultant side, you would see the RFP come up on a bidding platform. You would download it. You would decide if that's something your company wants to pursue. You would put together your package, submitted by the very specific due date in the format that's being asked, because with public bid, everything is very regimented. And then you would wait to find out if you made it and if your firm was selected. Once the consultant is selected, then it's when you can start thinking about actually doing the project work. So before we dive into full project execution, I just want to touch on what the key roles of being a consultant are in a project. First and foremost, as the consultant, you really want to make sure that you understand what the client's goals are for the project. Are they trying to fix a specific problem, or are they trying to do an overall restoration or renovation project? Sometimes even the client might not initially know exactly what they want or what they need. They might not also understand the historic significance of their building. So these are all areas that it becomes your job to kind of step in and help guide them, help them identify these things and the goals and the right path for them to get there. Without establishing that, you can't just, start a project and do it as you envisioned it, because that might not be the right path, and it won't be beneficial to the outcome of the project or for anyone, and you'll just have basically a disgruntled client, or you'll end up redoing a project because you will have to, take it down a different path than you initially thought, and that will just cost ultimately more money, more frustration, and more time for everyone. So then the next phase, after you kind of understand those goals and define the project with your client, obviously, is identifying the budget. Again, being able to define the project helps guide you to the budget and understand also a timeline for execution. Is this something that they're planning to do in 5 years and are just trying to get ahead of it to plan for the budget? Or is this a project that they are considering an immediate need and something they're looking for you to really quickly get through the steps of and get out to bid for contractors to work? This is critical in a lot of different institutions, for example, universities have a very specific timeline, like that they look for the design because they have a specific window that they need to complete the construction, which is summer when all the kids are gone. So you really have to be cognizant of what your client is looking for and understand their timeline. And then the last three things are similar, but just being collaborative with all the team members. There are a lot of people usually involved on these types of projects. There's the client, there's the overseeing agency, there might be a board that you need to seek approval from. There might be other sub-consultants, so you need to learn how to kind of work with everyone, and you need to be flexible because, again, meeting the goals that you've established might not work into everyone else's agenda. So you need to understand where you can compromise and how to work with others. And of course, just communicating, establishing clear communication up front is key to running a successful project. Everyone needs to be on board. Everyone needs to understand kind of what the timeline is, what the expectation is, and who to reach out to for what. So establishing communication early on is critical. The other thing I want to quickly touch on before going into more of the project process is, as we are obviously talking specifically about historic projects, specific considerations that we as consultants working for historic buildings have to take in account beyond the standard roles that you would do with any kind of design project. So obviously it is our job as building preservation consultants to understand the building status, understand its significance, understand its period of significance, and research the regulations and guidelines, understand what overseeing agencies we need to comply with and that we need to work with. And Miranda did a great job already explaining all of this in her presentation. But from our side, this is kind of our job to, start our project on the right foot and make sure that we are ready to take all of this on because we are tasked with working on this historic building. And we want to make these connections early because they will help guide our overall project approach. My recommendation is always to try to ask for permission first versus seeking forgiveness later. I always find that even, some people might be reluctant. They kind of want to, they're worried about asking, getting an overseeing agency involved because they're worried that they'll have to follow more regulations, have more restrictions for their project. I always find that people are a lot more willing to work with you if you ask ahead of time. These people also understand you have timelines, you have budget restrictions, you may not be able to do everything, and working with them up front, figuring out a pathway that makes sense from both perspectives is, I usually find, the better approach versus, sometimes maybe succumbing to the demands of your client saying like, I can't afford to do this, I want to do it this way. And, using substitute materials or things like that without asking ahead of time, I feel like it always causes more headaches down the road. And also, as a design professional in historic buildings, I don't feel comfortable doing that without seeking counsel from, these people that are responsible for kind of giving us the guidance for how to best repair these historic properties. Obviously, so that's engaging with all the stakeholders early, from the clients to the overseeing agencies, and also speaking with overseeing regulatory agencies. That's where you can understand potential sources of funding. Maybe there are community preservation funds that you can seek. Sometimes you might even be able to get a matching grant, even for something like the design services, depending on what your state or city regulations are. Some projects, obviously, you can get tax credits for. There are all sorts of opportunities. So engaging with everyone early on kind of helps you understand what all of these might be that are available to you. So next, project execution. Again, so the first step of every project, no matter where it's going, is the conditions assessment. You want to get to your building, you want to be able to evaluate your building, understand the conditions, understand the materials, because that will help determine, your approach for design and construction, and understand what is appropriate. So after all of the initial planning items have been addressed, that's when you begin your conditions assessment. You want to start with having a kickoff meeting to get everyone on the same page. So you want to have all your stakeholders at the table, get everyone involved right away. And that's where you break up all of everyone's roles and divide up the roles and responsibilities for the project. Then what you want to get into is, researching and reviewing existing information. This is where Miranda gave a lot of great resources for places, you can look for historic documentation. As most of us know, working with historic buildings, you often cannot find the original drawings. You often cannot find a lot of information. Your clients don't have it available. So you might be on your own seeking other sources. So you want to find as much information as possible right off the bat, so you understand, your building, and have all the information at hand once you go on site. Then you're going to be going on site. You're going to be doing a site analysis depending on the scope of your project, the budget of your project. This can vary. Obviously, we want to do as much as possible. At a minimum, a visual evaluation, but of course, more information is always better. So when you have the opportunity to do a lift survey, a drone survey, any sort of non-invasive testing, the more you do, the more information you get out of it, and the clearer your design becomes, the more accurate, I should say, your design becomes, because you have a much better understanding of how the building is put together. If there's an opportunity to do invasive testing, if it is appropriate, such as, limited removals of roofing materials or wall materials, to understand how things are put together to best develop a repair approach, that is always recommended, of course. But again, that is not always an option, depending on restrictions associated with the project or the budget. You might not be able to do that every single time. After you do your full investigation, you want to analyze your data. You want to make sure that you understand what all of these pieces you've collected are and what they mean and how to put them together. And you want to update your client. So if you've had any findings on your project that were critical, such as life safety things, you want to let the client know right away. You don't want to wait for You don't want them to wait for you to issue this report that might take a couple of months to put together, to learn that there's a hazardous condition on their building, such as a piece of masonry is about to fall, or an opening on a roof that can at least be temporarily patched so the water infiltration stops, things like that. And you want to just communicate with your client throughout the process period, because you want them to understand how your assessment went. You want them to know the timeline for the report development. If you need more time, you want to let them know right away. If you need to go back to the site, let them know why, things like that. It's just important to keep that line of communication going. And finally, you'll have all the information that you have, and you feel like you always want more, but you have to find a stopping point and just put everything you have together and generate your report. And in that report is where you will provide the recommendations for repairs and next steps. After your report is issued, you've kind of identified the overall scope of work in the report, but you haven't identified a lot of the specifics and the parameters of how to complete the work. You haven't done things maybe like reviewed the code compliance and things like that. So that's all things that will be done in design development. So after the report and you've met with your client and you've gotten direction for what they actually want to do with your findings, sometimes the client might say, well, we don't have the money to do all of this now, but we do want to tackle these items that you've identified as a priority. So you really need to have that discussion. You need to all be on the same page before moving forward to the design development phase. So in the design development phase, based on the direction you've gotten after reviewing your report recommendations, that's where you're going to really start to define the scope of work, because that scope of work is going to be based on what we were approved to move forward with. You're going to break down the scope of work more into the specific portions of the building so you can translate it onto the drawings and make clear documents. You're going to think about which trades are going to need to be involved, because that's going to help guide how you develop your documents for contractors to be able to bid. You're going to review code requirements, and you're going to confirm that your design intent meets those code requirements where it's needed. If there are upgrades you have to comply with, or changes that need to be made, so that you don't end up in a bind later, because you ultimately want to have all of this figured out in the design development phase, so you don't go through the full design and then realize, oh, I'm going to be required to upgrade these windows and have to go back and redesign your whole window section of the project. Again, once you've kind of defined all of the design elements, you're going to go back and you're going to consult with the historic commission or whoever you're working with on the historic side of things to make sure that the way you're approaching this is going to be in compliance. If there are any things you're questioning yourself on, in terms of if you're trying to do some sort of substitute material, you should review that early on so you don't get to construction. And then, of course, there is the budget. You want to make sure that you are working within a budget that is something that your project is going to be able to afford. Once you have all of those things figured out, then you kind of move on to the full design document phase. So the design documents, as sure most of you know, include the drawings and specifications. So basically, from the design development through the final design, the things that change in your design is just adding more detail. So, in the design development, you have your overall scope, and you have some of your technical stuff worked out. But with this next phase, you're going to be drawing all of your details. You're going to be writing all of your technical specifications. You're going to be kind of completing that design package to result in a set of bid documents, which are ready for contractor bidding, and ultimately going to become permit documents that are submitted, for approval through the city or whoever is providing your building permit. And with a historic project, there's often a component to that, if the building is in a historic district or a designated building, or has any other kind of distinctions to it, your project has to first get reviewed by a historic commission before it can get the building permit. So you have to fill out a certificate of appropriateness application, go through a review process, and kind of attach that as an amendment to your building application, and you won't get your permits signed off until you have that piece. There are a lot of differences between public and private bidding. Basically, what I want the takeaway from this to be, because everyone can look at this table and kind of, see all of the different components in here. But The main difference in the process that I think is key for us as consultants is that with public bidding, the bids often get awarded to lowest qualified bidder. So this means that as the design consultant who is doing the bid documents, it is basically your job to provide enough criteria in the qualifications for the bid documents so that the contractor who is selected is qualified. So you want to make sure that you are asking for things that you expect them to be able to do on your historic project. That means, you are asking for them to have previous work experience on similar projects, to provide references that you can check, to have the skill set that they need to successfully complete your project, because otherwise you might get someone who is less than qualified to work on your historic building, and there isn't much you can do about it if they've gone through the public bid process to disqualify that person, unless you have kind of this information as backup that they didn't meet the criteria stipulated. After your project goes through the bidding, the next part and the contractor is selected, the contracts are signed, you can finally get to your construction phase. Although this phase can often be very stressful in a project, I think it's really my favorite phase of any project, because this is where you can see your planning and all of your design actually become reality. And you can see the building repairs come out, and hopefully they come out how you envision them, and you can see this building that might be, in a state of disrepair kind of come back to life. So this is ultimately my favorite part, even though going through all of the steps of it could be stressful, and sometimes you do in construction encounter some stressful situations that you have to work through. So in terms of the parts of construction administration phase, typically you start with a submittal review. You want to make sure that the materials the contractor is submitting are what you specified. This is your chance to be able to review, approve, and reject anything, ask them to come back and provide what you're asking for. Then, of course, you have to review, the schedule for the project to make sure that the project can be completed in the time needed. You have to review the SOV's schedule of values. So basically, how much they are carrying for each of the scopes of work. This way, when you are reviewing their payment applications, you understand if what they're asking to be paid for that amount of time is appropriate for the work they've done. It makes your job a lot easier for approving payment applications. Once you get on site, I can't say this enough, mock-ups. Like with historic projects, we always want to see mock-ups for anything from mortar colors to, how a stone is repaired, to sheet metal roofing, see sections of gutters, see how the roof is put together, see all of the layers, from paint colors to sealant colors, like everything. Approving it on paper is one thing, but seeing it done on the building is completely different. And the mock-up is what gives you the chance to make sure that, they can execute on site. And once you approve a mock-up, that becomes the standard for the work. And then just being on top of it throughout the course of the project. You want to have regular site meetings to make sure everyone's on the same page, to make sure anything that needs to be reviewed by other stakeholders is being reviewed. And you want to document everything that's happening so it's a record for the project. And then finally, you want to keep in communication with the SHPO or whoever is overseeing your project. Sometimes you will be sending them progress updates on your project, so that they can see what's going on. You can let them know when a mock-up is being installed. Sometimes they want to come out to site to review something, but again, just being in regular communication to make sure that the project is going according to approved plan. finally, when you've gotten through all that, the last phase of the project, the wrap up and the closeout. So if you're going to be doing punch list inspections, you want to make sure that anything, that you've been looking at is done properly and finished properly. So any of those remaining items, the punch list is your chance. You might be doing this for a big building by scopes, like you might be doing roofing one day, windows one day, masonry one day. Or if you're doing elevations, you might be going by elevation. So there might be multiple punch lists. Then you want to leave your client with a comprehensive closeout package. So next time a project comes up, they have information and people aren't saying to the next person or you for working on it again, I don't have anything, whatever was done previously wasn't documented, we don't know, and someone else has to start from scratch. This is where your client also gets any warranties for materials and from the contractors. So anything that, might need maintenance or might need fixes down the line, they have the warranties to prove that. The last thing I have on here is maintenance plan. If possible, it's great when you can issue a maintenance plan and if it's followed, because it can make sure that, if your roof is replaced, but then your gutters are never cleaned, or if a slate roof is redone, it still needs maintenance over the course of time, because that's what's going to give it the longevity that, you intended in the design. If you don't keep up with it, it's going to become in disrepair and become a full construction project versus, as Miranda said, the preference is always maintenance first. Finally, takeaways. I think Miranda said the exact same thing. Every project is unique. With every project, we want to understand the stakeholders, the budget, and the goals. You want to use all your available resources. You want to be collaborative. You want to have constant communication, and be flexible without compromising those main goals that you defined in the beginning. Every project is going to require some compromises, but there's certain things you have to know that you're not going to compromise on. Finally, last slide, some resources for everyone. APTI is a great one. It's, an organization that's both technical and historic focused. I believe there's a lot of opportunities for emerging professionals for reduced cost or free events. Preservation briefs, as Miranda said, these are always a go-to because they have everything from materials to overall approaches to things like they're constantly coming up with new ones that are relevant to what's going on now. So the latest one is on codes, and the last one is just a book I always go to when you can't find those drawings. This kind of gives me a good baseline for every kind of building system and what to expect in terms of the traditional detailing. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Olga. That was wonderful. We have a few minutes, and at this point, I'd like to transition to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So Miranda, if you'd like to join us as well, and to everyone in the audience, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, you could please go ahead and submit them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at this time. And I see that Miranda did directly answer a question we had about the Texas State Historical Building Code, if there was such a thing. Thank you for putting that link into the chat, Miranda. We have a few other questions here that perhaps each of you could address as appropriate. The first one is, can you give an example of a time when you witnessed an unexpected restriction or threat to a historic preservation project?
Well, I think every single project is going to have surprises, and that's going to pop up. And I think the best thing you can do is just to make sure you're budgeting for those possibilities at the beginning, and thinking about what to anticipate might be a problem that you might face. As far as just, I mean, in that I review several different projects every day. I don't know where to start. Like every single project has something unexpected, whether or not finding mold or insect damage or structural issues. Once you start to do selective demoing, you're gonna find all kinds of things. And
Yeah.
so just anticipating that that's going to be a possibility.
Yeah,
Olga,
I
do you
think,
have any very specific examples?
yeah, similar. I feel like there's been so many, but carrying contingency, I mean, no matter how much you think you've looked at the building and how well you think you know it, and if you have drawings or not, carrying contingency is critical, and how much contingency might depend on the project or just your owner's budget availability. But with, to piggyback off Miranda said, like, on a recent project we were working with a historic building, but the windows had been replaced, sealants had been redone. And the client said, these windows were put in 20 years ago. No, we don't need to test the sealants. Everything's fine. Sure enough, when we get scaffolding up on the building and we're up close, we see there are layers of sealants underneath. So lo and behold, the previous contractor who replaced the windows apparently did them from the inside, didn't scrape. So we really had asbestos sealant under every single new window. And we were replacing the sealants because the way they had installed the sealants, they were all failing because they weren't bonded. They were over old sealants. But that was a huge cost that we weren't expecting, and prevented us from doing another, small part of the project, but we had to remove it from scope to kind of balance the budget.
Yeah, I was recently with a team that was looking at a historic courthouse, and they were telling us how they had found that every single window in the bottom left-hand corner had issues. And it was apparently because in the installation of those windows, as they were installing them, the person that was dedicated to just that side was not doing the detail correctly, so they could just see that same problem over and over in the exact same place. So
That's so interesting. You really start to understand that there's a story behind all of the buildings for sure.
right.
This question is, what are your strategies for researching at the beginning of the project? And what resources do you tend to find yourself using with the projects? Are there any resources you can think of besides the ones that you mentioned, or any strategies for doing research?
Is historical research specifically?
I think so.
The first thing I always look for, and hopefully you can see, I always look to see if it's on the National Register first, because that National Register nomination form is going to have a tremendous amount of information, and that's why it's just fantastic to have National Register districts and individually listed properties, or contributing, sometimes even contributing properties to a National Register district will have information. So I always look for that first.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then it varies by state and city. Like the Massachusetts Historic Commission has a great website, and you can find electronic listings and applications, but then depending on the state and the town, it's not always consistent. But after the National Register, I usually go to that, and then usually to like a city, the city inspectional department for any drawings, and then libraries sometimes will have archival drawings. But any kind of historic agency, city and state, go to. They just aren't always digitized, and sometimes the paper has been lost somewhere, so it can be a dead end, frustrating process.
Yeah. So, and reach out to your SHPO, because they may have documentation and information about it too.
Thank you. Can you talk just very briefly, because we are at 1 o'clock, but we could get through a couple more questions quickly. Can you talk just a little bit about risk and which parties are responsible for which parts of preservation projects? What if you as a consultant make a recommendation that the client ignores? Have you ever had a situation like that?
I'll let you answer that, Olga, since you're You're more in the
I
trenches with
can't think
that.
of a specific example, but yes, I know it's happened, and I think, your main option at that point is just to kind of document that because you can't force your client's hand to do something that, they're not willing to do for whatever reason. Worst case scenario is, which I feel like has happened not specifically on my project, but to people I know, is you've had to walk away from a project because you just have to at some point evaluate, where you stand as a design professional to ultimately your stamp that's going on this project. If you're really not comfortable, if it's gonna, pose any sort of risk, or if it's really against, if it's a historic building and it's against any historic um, kind of regulations and you're not comfortable, I think your ultimate final kind of, which you never want to do, but is to walk away, say, I can't do that, and you need to work with someone else.
And
Okay.
also, just, what type of contract is being used between the client, preservation architect, and the contractor, that's going to lay out who's carrying the risks and for what as well. So be very important to understand contracts.
Okay. And Olga, you had mentioned bidding platforms where you would find RFPs or RFQs. Can you give any examples of what those are?
BidNet is one of them. Combis is another one. They're often not easy to navigate. Um, and a lot of towns will post on their own websites, their own, building websites. So I think there are paid memberships that you can get that make the process much easier. Otherwise, it's kind of searching and weeding out the projects that, think are applicable to you.
Okay. And I think if we could just quickly answer one last question, this one is kind of fun. Madison would like to know, what was the coolest historic project that each of you have worked on?
Well, I'm very, very fortunate because my region is East Texas. So I get to review all of NASA Johnson Space Center historic preservation work. So I'm excited that I get to follow along and, review the proposed treatments for mission control and and the mission control center and all the different historical um, uh, sites, at Johnson Space Center. So that's super exciting.
For me, I keep going back to this one church in Connecticut, that it was a steeple restoration, and it was like the church was listed on a most endangered, list in Hartford, Connecticut. It was in a really depressed area of the town, but it really meant a lot to the community. So just having the opportunity to restore this, wasn't even the whole church, the whole steeple was the only thing that was funded, and the front kind of portico cornice. Having the opportunity to work on a project like that just meant so much to the community. Forget the fact that we were working with like an amazing team and contractor. So it was just like a very rewarding process. And, we were working with SHPO and they were understanding of the funding restrictions. So we were able to do some substitutes, but overall, the project just came out better than anyone expected. And the contractor even put on some uplighting on the steeple at the end, just because they care too. And then going to the whole ceremony for that and having the community just kind of say thank you, and seeing how much it meant to everyone and how it revitalized the area. I'd say that was my favorite project.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you both so much. Thank you for this great Q&A session and wonderful presentations. Very informative. I'd like to thank everyone who's viewing for joining us today. We are especially grateful for the two of you for sharing your time and expertise with us. Our speakers have shared some of their top recommended resources with us, and we will be posting these recommendations on our website later this week on the Bridging the Gap webpage for anyone who's looking for further information on these topics. If we didn't get to your question today, please feel free to send it to us at programs@worldheritageusa.org. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.